Lukonde, or should I pronounce it differently?
No, you're pronouncing it just fine. You can call me Luke as well, but you're pronouncing it fine.
Awesome. I think we just went live.
Yep.
Welcome everyone to the MultiCloud panel. I hope everyone's having a great day so far. First of all, we'd like everyone to feel open to interact in the chat. So we want to make this kind of interactive. It's kind of up to you if you want to also write something in the chat or just listen in. Either way is fine to us. So today we want to kind of discuss MultiCloud, where it's going, where we think it's going, and what kind of the impacts are for us. And for that, first of all, I'd like to start with a small introduction round. So Lukonde, go ahead, introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure. So as Marcel said, my name is Lukonde. You can also call me Luke. I'm a senior software engineer at Intellect Software in South Africa, working mostly in the cloud and DevOps space. And so very much in tune with what's happening in the cloud and cloud native space, primarily working in the AWS environment. I'm also a container hero, but do have experience with other cloud providers as well. So, yeah.
Okay, my name is Derek Ashmore. I'm the application transformation principal or lead at Asperitas Consulting in Chicago. And that's a high-sounding title, but what it really means is I escort our customers' applications to the cloud. We do a lot of work on the AWS side and on the Azure side. And all of our customers have footprints in multiple clouds. Given the fact that most of our customers are Fortune 2000, it's typically AWS and Azure with a small percentage GWP, but we do a lot of multi-cloud-like stuff. So that's where I come from.
Awesome. And finally, myself, I'm Marcel Müller. I work at GiantSwarm as a platform engineer, and there I mostly work on Kubernetes operators and like infrastructure automation, as well as DevOps kind of general release engineering, I would say. And here we have a lot of like larger companies that are using mostly Kubernetes or purely Kubernetes, and nearly all of them like a multi-cloud environment where they use AWS and Azure or AWS on-premise and so on. So that's where I'm interacting, and I'm also active in like the Kubernetes SIG cluster API, which is like purely multi-cloud, basically how to run Kubernetes on multiple clouds. Awesome. So to just like get into it to start right off, I would be really interested in what you think is like the major selling point for multi-cloud. Like, what do you think is the point that's driving companies or users to adopt the multi-cloud approach from your experience? Like, go ahead. Whoever wants to go first can go first.
I'll go first. Basically, at our customers, the idea for multi-cloud comes out of an executive idea of business continuity. The idea of being reliant on one vendor makes executives in on our customer staffs a little bit apoplectic. Now, we get that at the 10,000 foot level. You come down to ground level and you see all the technical differences and the proprietary differences between the different ones. And the idea that your workload can seamlessly transfer if AWS has an outage, run on GCP or Azure. That is much easier said than done. But at an executive level, they see it as a business continuity idea. It's also reflects the fact that they don't exactly know who's exactly where the cloud market's going to go, right? So you don't want to be the person that invested in a cloud vendor that declines in popularity. So given that you don't know, and I think the top two really still are AWS and Azure, with GCP trying to catch up. And I hope I'm not sparking a religious war by saying that. But it's more a business level decision than a technical level decision a lot of times. And that was entirely too long. Lukonde, do you have some takes on that question?
Yeah, no, I really appreciated your insight, and I'm very glad you mentioned that workload portability is a lot easier said than done. And I agree with your points. I definitely think when it comes to multi-cloud, I think a number of businesses are sort of driven from that defensive approach of sort of like, we don't want to end up locked into one particular vendor. But I think with multi-cloud, another thing that is really useful is when companies understand that there's some technical versatility that their teams will be able to have. On the one hand, obviously, essentially one of the main driving forces with cloud is operational agility. And you want that operational agility to not be specific to one particular provider. So you get that opened up more for your technical teams. If you're working on some kind of solution whereby you need a storage service, and a team is free to essentially kind of do POCs, whether it's like, okay, I think S3 is what's going to work for us in this tooling. If we need an OCR tool, and then they say, okay, actually what Azure provides is superior for what we're trying to achieve more than what AWS offers with recognition. So that kind of technical versatility as well, with helping teams kind of have a more optimal solution, and they can focus more on what gives us the best, as opposed to what can we have based on what we can work with in this particular cloud provider. So I think those would be some main driving forces. Obviously, as well, there's cost optimization, but I think cost optimization is another thing that's easier said than done. I really think when it comes to the cloud, I really believe the graph is one of you mature over time when it comes to cost optimization, whether it's a single cloud or you're doing a multi-cloud approach. But yeah, I think those would be some of the main motivation factors.
Yeah, just really quickly, I would like to add on to the cost optimization stuff. Something we haven't talked about yet is different cloud providers also wanting different customers on their services, right? So what sometimes happens is you get discounts on a specific cloud provider to use the cloud provider and hopefully exclusively. Yeah. So kind of from my experience, Azure has been very active in that, like giving very deep discounts in the first year or two to kind of attract new customers to their service. The problem with these discounts is they run out eventually, right? So you're not going to have a discount forever. And this is kind of like where multi-cloud comes into play. Customers also need to be aware that this is a possibility that they lock themselves into one specific cloud, and therefore should be wary of a multi-cloud approach, or should be aware that they should focus on something like this. So I think all the points you mentioned were extremely valid and made total sense to me. What I would like to be interested now is, so we talked about how there's like different models for multi-cloud and different approaches, why it makes sense. Would you, from a system perspective, like from a software architecture point of view, usually say that customers, or that you would recommend an approach where you basically have applications in different clouds communicating with each other? Or would you generally say that the deployments to each cloud are kind of like encapsulated in the individual clouds? So for example, if we have some services running on AWS and some services running on Azure, is there a lot of cross communication for you going on between Azure or AWS, or do you generally try to keep it in one cloud?
Speaking from our customer's perspective, it's not possible to keep everything in one cloud. Typically what we see is applications have dependencies. For our customers, most of the time it's on-premise, but it can be in other clouds. And the way we try to get our customers to work with that scenario is basically leverage the internet on-ramps. All right. So I wish I had a whiteboard, but each cloud is basically about 2 milliseconds away from the internet on-ramp. All right. Whereas most on-premise environments are north of 20 milliseconds away, more often 40 milliseconds away from an on-ramp, something along those lines. And one of the holdovers for most of our customers is they try to make their workloads on-premise data-centric, but that hits them on the latency side, right? So if you're going to have traffic go between multiple clouds, it's much less expensive to say have traffic go from Azure to AWS or AWS to Azure, because you can cross connect at the on-ramp, right? So that puts that latency down to less than 5 milliseconds if you do that. A lot of our customers are still in the mindset where on-premise is basically they look at it as their hub. The problem is that to go from AWS to Azure, for example, you're going to burn 40 milliseconds getting to your data center, and then you're going to burn 40 milliseconds getting out to the second cloud provider. And that, in other words, what really needs to happen is you need to make the paradigm shift to move your hub out to one of the clouds or to the colo where things are cross-connected rather than on-premise, because that is expensive from the latency side, but it's also expensive from the bandwidth side. It's much cheaper to pay for additional bandwidth between Azure and an on-ramp or AWS and an on-ramp than it is to pay for the same kind of bandwidth from your on-premise network to the on-ramp, usually.
Usually, yes. I would also like to add here really quickly that in our experience, at least, the biggest cost you will have very quickly when you run something like requests or traffic intensive is going to be actually the way out of the cloud provider. So it's going to be outbound traffic into the internet or to somewhere else. And that becomes very critical. Where do you actually locate where all this is going to happen? So this is also my opinion, kind of what, when you design a multi-cloud approach, it's kind of important to realize how is traffic going to be flowing and which cost is it going to be producing. So if you can encapsulate something in one cloud provider, like in AWS, it's going to be a lot cheaper than having a lot of traffic go from AWS. You pay the fee to get out of AWS, and then you pay the fee again to get into Azure, for example. And Derek, do you have any experience with this as well? I don't know.
Well, that hints at internet and ingress.
Yes.
There's a lot of network thought that goes into handling internet egress and ingress, and that gets into your cost angle. But it also gets complicated as you grow from on-premise to one or more clouds, right? And typically, what you do want to do as far as managing costs, and I'm going to get myself in trouble, but I'm not sure. Do you get egress costs going on the AWS side, going out direct connect?
I'm not sure about direct connect. Lukonde, do you know for sure?
That I'm not 100% sure.
I remember it being that way. You don't get anything for free in terms of traffic on AWS.
Right. So if you do get penalized for direct connect, whether you send it out through the on-ramps or it goes over the internet, it doesn't matter. I thought, and it's been a while since my AWS cert exam, but I thought that basically if you hosted it properly with VPC endpoints and that kind of stuff, that you didn't really get hit as much for direct connect egress as you do over the internet. And that's really where networking comes into play. I think the multi-cloud discussion, and I've been centering on networking, but we need to talk about applications too, because I think that's a different layer. I think they both aspects have play here.
Yeah, Lukonde, first of all, can you confirm kind of the network discussion we just had? I know you've been kind of silent on it, but nodding a lot. So it seems like yes, but also on the application side, what would be your experience with the multi-cloud approach?
Yeah, so on the network side, you actually mentioned traffic flow, which is what I was going to say is, something that you definitely want to consider. And this is where it also gets kind of contextual. So, for example, I'm in the financial services sector over here. And so where your data lives is also very important. And in our context, we've got Azure and AWS over here, but GCP aren't here. So if you're trying to go with a multi-cloud approach over there, that does put them in a good situation. But AWS just recently came here in terms of setting up their data center. Prior to that, most would be using Ireland region. So you'd be considering things like that as well, the cost implications of traffic between workloads in Azure here in South Africa and Ireland in Europe. So those are some things that you'll also be considering. And in addition to that, just before we actually started this session, Derek and I were chatting about how the hybrid model, I think, is still the most popular when it comes to most cloud paradigms that companies are adopting, and that's a big thing again with the financial services sector, and that that's why I say it's also very contextual. And so now when you start thinking about that same traffic flow, you're not just looking at traffic between these data centers, you're also looking at traffic coming to on-prem, and a lot of it will probably be coming back to on-prem depending on what may be. Depending on the application, if there's some kind of authentication that has to happen or some kind of storage. And getting to the application side of it, this is where, it also depends on, is your application stateless? I think in that case, it might make it a little bit simpler because this is where you start to have red tape or governance issues of where is our data going to live, et cetera. And some of those things can be industry or business specific, or maybe even country specific. But if you have your data centers in a similar region, and it gets a little bit use case specific, but this is something that is possible. And there are some platforms that maybe make it a little bit easier. I mean, you mentioned Kubernetes earlier on, Marcel, right? It's sort of agnostic. It's one of the things that it has going for it, why it's so popular. But even then, as much as it may be cloud agnostic, if you're going to go with a platform like, if you're using GKE. And you're, in GCP, and you're using EKS and AWS, with time, and this is an argument I usually like to make, is that with time, eventually, you're going to want to benefit from the native integrations in that specific cloud provider, which starts to present that some of those challenges of how easy will it be to lift and shift, because then your application starts to be affected by that, because your application, is essentially based on your Helm charts and manifest files, which will have specific state definitions. And so you have to start considering, okay, how portable is our application between these two different platforms and different providers that we're starting to leverage more and more their native integrations. Like, those are some complexities that you have to start considering.
Yeah, exactly. And I would also add to that cloud providers try to provide more of these features that are like specific to their cloud, like with EKS, AKS, with different managed services for databases and so on by the cloud provider. And what we also recently saw was like this whole discussion about basically Amazon using like free open source software like Grafana and so on, and kind of like going ahead and doing their own proprietary software, basically, or a software offering, managed software offering on top of them to kind of lock customers into that. And that all makes it then, if you start using these services, it makes it harder to follow a true multi-cloud approach, because suddenly those don't exist anymore on different cloud providers.
Yeah,
right. Where we see some of that encroachment is really in the security realm. So, for instance, on the AWS side, you can have Kubernetes workloads assume IAM roles to get access to their resources, and AKS on the Azure side has quickly started to follow up on that. So essentially, that makes it a little bit harder, because those workloads don't have to deal with things like credentials and stuff, which will make it harder for it to move. If it were to move, like, say, on premise, and suddenly it would have security concerns that it might not have in one of the cloud vendors.
Yeah, so in my job as a kind of working as as like at a company that is basically a managed Kubernetes provider, we struggle with the same thing because we provide Kubernetes on different clouds. So we provide it on AWS, Azure, and on-premise. And there exactly we kind of see the problem that we want to use some of these features that are cloud specific, but then even your Kubernetes gets more specific to the cloud provider. And that brings a lot of problems when you try to explain to customers that have kind of like bought into Kubernetes as this cloud independent thing, that there are things that are suddenly not cloud independent. And this is also something where from a 10,000 foot view that gets overlooked a lot, in my opinion, because from a 10,000 foot view, you just see it's cloud independent. I can use it anywhere, and then I can just lift and shift it to a different location, where then in reality, a management decision gets made and the engineers are sitting there, well, now we need to rebuild all kinds of stuff because we have kind of built on top of this proprietary software.
Right.
So this is very difficult.
Is a great example of that. The serverless implementations on the AWS side and the Azure side differ drastically. You aren't going to have, it's very difficult to have the same serverless workloads designed for one cloud and move it to another cloud. There are ways to limit the contact points, but still, that's very difficult. I am interested. Have either of you seen any movement towards native or kubeless or OpenFOSS or some of the serverless-like products that make Kubernetes appear serverless? I haven't seen any traction in my customer set for those products.
I have seen a lot of talking about it. There's a lot of things of like buzz about it and people trying it out. But whenever it gets to a serious use case, as far as I have experienced, it kind of dies at the cost point, so that when you scale massively, the cost also goes up a lot more than just like when you would be using Kubernetes. And it kind of seems like a way of like, it's kind of cool and people want to do it, but there's no real applicable use cases half the time where it makes sense from an architectural or business point of view, because you're locking yourself in so hard and because the cost just in what I've seen just becomes unreasonable if you go into like a larger scale. So it's mainly like very small scale stuff I've seen.
Yeah, Derek, I can't say that I've seen much traction in that regard. I think it has the same weight behind it in terms of what makes serverless so appealing, because of the whole idea of, well, then we get to focus more on our application and we offload the management overhead. I can't say that I've seen a lot of traction in that regard.
Awesome. Very quickly to follow up from this. So we kind of talked about how applications are also designed about the individual cloud features and so on. Would you say that the developer mindset has also been changing in the past few years? So do you see developers pushing for a multi-cloud approach, or do you see more developers in the point of view that they just want one cloud because they know what's going on and then they don't care about if it's really portable and so on? Maybe Lukonde?
Yeah, sure. So to be honest, I actually have seen more of a leaning towards a single cloud provider. Reason being, if we're looking at, small projects like pet projects on the side, it's a lot easier to get into a multi-cloud, right? You've got the time, you don't have as much complexity. There's a lot of free reign that you have. That the game changes when it's enterprise architecture. It's a lot harder, and usually you don't need just a base level of understanding when it comes to the respective cloud providers. You need to have a decent level of knowledge, and that's something that takes time. So you could have a team that consists of different people that sort of specialize in the different cloud providers, and maybe kind of model it could work. But I've still seen, at least in my context, a leaning more towards, this is the cloud provider that I have experience with and knowledge with, and I'd like to work more towards it. It's only if you have some kind of technical guidance and leadership sort of saying that, hey, actually, consider these options as well with these other cloud providers when it comes to this particular service and what you're trying to achieve over here. But yeah, I it's a difficult thing. And I've got friends that go as far as saying that, multi-cloud is a myth. When it comes to workload portability, what I did want to mention as well is I think workflow portability is more achievable through tools like Terraform, because it's agnostic. So there wouldn't be too much that would have to change in a developer's day-to-day, or sysops and DevOps in their day-to-day with the automation, because it's the same syntax. There would still be changes, but it's totally different with kind of going from using CloudFormation to another tool that is very specific for another cloud provider.
Yeah, most of our customers are leveraging Terraform for infrastructure as code, as opposed to CloudFormation or ARM on the Azure side. So,
yeah, it's kind of interesting to me. It's also kind of what I see from a developer point of view, that basically the developers want to stay where it's comfortable. They know what they are doing on one cloud provider. They don't have a big incentive to use a different cloud provider or learn about it, because also the usage is like extremely different Azure compared to AWS. Like some things are just completely upside down from a thinking point of view. For me, it's especially like failure zones, and like compared to availability zones and so on, is very different on how it's designed and how it works. And therefore, developers, in my experience, are not very interested in it. It's mostly leadership and stakeholders that are very interested in it. And that's also why I feel like the discussion sometimes on the technical side dies down a little bit, because we should do it this way, but the motivation is not always 100% there. Yeah. But also very interesting to note that you say that the teams use, for example, Terraform for provisioning, or use not the cloud provider specific tooling. This is actually where I have seen, or where I have personally also done the opposite. So when we provision stuff, we use CloudFormation extensively, and we use ARM templates extensively. And the reasoning is simple, but also kind of weird. There are some things where these toolings are just generally superior, in my opinion, to a non-native tooling, simply because they have built in some functionalities that allow for easier setup of failure redundant systems. So when you have a CloudFormation stack, you can see in AWS what is happening and what is actually restarting, and you get a nice event log, and everything is kind of fine and dandy, and you can press a button and it tells you what has drifted and so on. So yeah. These are benefits you just don't get with other tooling. And this is kind of the problem. Again, it's not only the integration point of view, but also the infrastructure management itself is so different that, sure, you can use independent tooling, but you will miss out on some of the benefits. And for me, it's especially on AWS, I wouldn't want to do it without CloudFormation, just because from my experience, it's so much more comfortable. And at the same time, on Azure with ARM, ARM templates are very powerful, but it has grown a lot in the past year or two, and I have mostly touched it like 2 years ago. But there's some stuff that is very unintuitive to someone coming from an AWS background, even though it's very powerful. So I can see the pros and cons, but I would be more leaning towards let's use individual cloud provider tooling point of view.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I can tell you from a Terraform perspective, essentially, Terraform follows changes in AWS a lot more closely than you'll find on the Azure side, particularly with very new services and very new features on services. The case where you have to drop out of Terraform and use ARM on the Azure side is much more frequent than on the AWS side. And I think the reason for that is AWS basically eats their own dog food, right? The SDKs and the APIs basically get new features first before even the AWS council gets them. And I've made on the Azure side, that's not the case. The SDK that Terraform relies on is actually the last one in the food chain to get the new features, which is why you end up, unfortunately, on the Azure side, dropping into ARM templates for specific things, particularly if it's a new service that's just out of preview.
Yeah, I can agree with that. The only thing that I've seen is like increased investment from Microsoft in the Kubernetes space, like really increased. Like there's a lot more developers working upstream now that are from Microsoft as well as VMware, in my experience, and Red Hat, obviously, compared to AWS. So this is kind of like as you said, it's like a different paradigm where the companies just work differently at a very large scale currently. So one question I would kind of then follow this up with, we talked a lot about like architecture, we talked a lot about how things are built and how things are run. And I would be very specific now on the operational knowledge. How do you see your interactions with like operations teams? So we are mainly at the DevOps conference, but let's focus on the ops part a little bit more. Do you see any challenges that customers face on the operational point of view, or do you kind of see like they just kind of do it as they go?
I would classify the biggest challenge on the operational side is that people who are knowledgeable on-premise technologies, particularly networking and VMware and some of the tooling that you use there, basically apply what I call a steel copy of a wooden bridge type of mentality. When they get into the cloud, they assume it's just a technology change and not the paradigm shift that it is. And they quickly learn that the old way of siloing technologies and things like that, techniques like that, just don't work in the cloud and work in the DevOps automation paradigm. Because in DevOps, there are all sorts of cross-cutting concerns that automation engineers deal with, which you don't seem to get on premise. I will tell you, because we've implemented several enterprise architectures, both on the AWS and the Azure side. The biggest Achilles heel is on-premises networking, because typically that is not automated. Typically that's all manual. And if you're working in the cloud and only in the cloud, IPs are free. If you're connected to an on-premise network, you'll find out that IPs are not free. That if you want that new network accessible from everywhere in the organization, network engineers for on-premises go running into the hills, because the routing changes they need to do to make those new networks work is just not fun. And so that I think is one of the largest challenges, at least that we face at the level we deal with.
Yeah, not much to add to that. I think Derek has hit the nail on the head there, and I think that's definitely a universal thing, man. Ops teams, I think, one of the main barriers, of which you could argue maybe it's actually, from leadership down, except for your more cloud engineers and developers. It really is a mind shift change in understanding what cloud is meant to do, and actually making that transition is very difficult, and usually is what presents some of those barriers.
Yeah, I completely also agree with the on-premise part as well, and the barriers part. On-premise is always a struggle, especially in a multi-cloud context, because you have like these two mindsets kind of competing. On the one hand, kind of the more cloud-centric mindset where you're connecting to, and on the other hand, you still have this old data center this is not old data center, but generally a data center where you have to take care of all these things. Yeah. And this is always kind of competing wherever you go and whoever you talk to. What I also wanted to bring up really quickly was, from an operational point of view, I also see people struggling with the context switch between clouds. So that the first question they always ask themselves is, where's this running now? Is this now running on AWS? Is this now running on Azure? Is this running somewhere else? Because depending on the cloud, you can have different problems as well. It's not as clean sometimes as we want it to be, where also like you can have limitations from the cloud provider, like on AWS, very famously, like you can have like not enough VPC peering connections in your account, and then you need to write a ticket and whatever. And all of this is like contextual knowledge that you, as someone that deals with operations, need to know for a specific cloud provider that you don't get given for free somewhere. And this really provides a challenge to operational teams when they're asked to spread out something, when they're asked to, okay, expand your horizon now for 2 more cloud providers. They also go running for the hill, because how are they supposed to deal with all this knowledge that they suddenly are supposed to have, where there are differences, even though we would like to say it's all the same in the cloud.
Yeah. I'm fond of telling people that I learn for a living and take time out to let clients benefit from what I've learned. And I think there's part of that for all of us, particularly in the DevOps world. It's not just the 2 clouds, but the number of tools that we have, and the amount of cross-cutting concerns we have to deal with. Since I got into the cloud, I know far more about networking and system administration kinds of things than I ever did as an application developer in the 90s. So,
yeah, and just to add to that, one of the issues as well, we kind of touched on it earlier with what are the inclinations for developers, and the challenge being that they want to be in a comfortable situation, because it is difficult to all of a sudden become very proficient in different cloud providers. And in that kind of situation, developers will typically be working with a particular application. You put yourself in the situation of ops teams. Like in my context, your ops teams are large and they are responsible for a variety of workloads, so they don't have the luxury, so to say, of just dealing with one particular use case and trying to hone in on that. They have to deal with several different scenarios. And that makes it even more complex. You're dealing with multiple enterprise architectures, and you're dealing with, how do I do this in the best possible way? Because, with these kinds of systems, security has to be a priority. We have to figure out the best way of doing these things with these different cloud providers. So, figuring that out, it can definitely be intimidating. It's a huge space that they need to grow in a, you could argue, in a short space of time. Yeah,
I completely agree. And what I've seen from larger organizations adopting this approach of multi-cloud is then also it kind of usually not a very smooth way, but it enforces like this, you build it, you run it mentality, so that the teams that actually build the software also become more responsible for running it, because they usually also made the decision where to run it. And then it kind of makes more sense from an organizational point of view that they should also be the ones responsible for actually running it. And it moves away from like these big ops teams towards every team is like a cross-cutting team, and this multi-cloud approach kind of enforces that. But I have to say, in most organizations I've seen this happen, it's not a very smooth transition. So a lot of the time in conferences we heard like these success stories of like how the company was transformed, but in my opinion, it's very rarely just a smooth success story. It's very often a very painful process, where a company needs to not only change from a technical point of view or from the engineering point of view, but also from a leadership and management point of view, to kind of realize that this is what they need and go through with that change. And that is usually very, very filled with friction, I would say.
Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, just real quick on that, Marcel. You're absolutely right. And that's usually the thing, right? We're drawn to these things because of the technical benefits, and we neglect the cultural side of it. It's like microservices as well. Like I have this conversation with friends often. It's very appealing. It's a buzzword, but sometimes businesses overlook the fact that one of the main catalysts to actually succeeding in that area is the cultural side of it. There's a change. There has to be a drastic change in how your teams work in order for it to succeed. And I think it's a similar thing with multi-cloud as well, there has to be a cultural shift. And this problem I don't think this problem is going away anytime soon, because hybrid is still the most popular model. Whether or not businesses, I'm sure a number of businesses would potentially like to completely shift, but it's not that simple when you're dealing with large organizations that do have a backbone of legacy systems that date back for a number of years.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, even when you go from one cloud to multiple clouds, just going to the cloud from on-premise, that's a major paradigm shift in a world where everything's now software. So.
Yeah, for sure. And also what Lukonde said is very true. Like, it's very easy to say you build it, you run it, if you've built it. If you are like inheriting some legacy stuff, who's going to run it and who's going to make sure that it now runs in a multi-cloud context? It's extremely difficult for companies that aren't just starting up and can like start with this paradigm, that have to like shift into it and have all these legacy concerns to deal with.
I think even for companies that start out in the cloud, legacy debt is a universal, or technical debt is a universal problem, right? I don't think the cloud really solves that. No. I don't think any of the specific cloud vendors solve that. It's just, it's possible to do that with any technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you can build on top of technologies that's 5 years old. If you build on top of like some Kubernetes competitors 5 years ago, you can now find yourself in a position where suddenly Kubernetes is the thing to go to, and you are working on a legacy kind of environment where people are not as hyped about it anymore. So obviously this can happen very quickly, and it will happen again for sure. We're not going to be in a standstill, I believe. Even with Kubernetes, if it's going to be around forever, I'm not convinced. Even though I work on developing it, but it's just the reality of things, I would say.
Yeah. So, Marcel, if I may, just a question for both of you. So, as much as things are so exciting here in Africa with cloud adoption and it increasing in popularity, I think we're still a little bit on the tail end compared to what's happening in Europe and America. I'd like to hear your thoughts and experience when it comes to multi-cloud with data portability, when it's not stateless applications that you're dealing with, and how you go about that.
So in Germany, I can say basically every company I've interacted with is thinking about it at the very least. Not all of them are doing it, and a lot of them are not doing it because privacy laws and data privacy are very big in Germany. So there is a lot of data where you cannot easily move it to the cloud. It's getting easier with like AWS getting certain certifications and so on, and certain cloud providers now like specific regions in Germany. One example would be the Azure region. There's like a EU something region that's basically just Germany, and it was previously German cloud, where they try to acknowledge that fact and get more people to move, especially in Germany. But I can see it in every company I've interacted with is thinking about it or is doing it right now. Derek?
In the States, I can tell you that the percentage of the IT footprint for all of our customers in the cloud, in one of the clouds at least, is gradually increasing year to year. All right. The types of companies that we deal with are typically larger companies, and with that, they are less agile. They're not going to switch tomorrow, which is why, to your point, Lukonde, that hybrid cloud is basically here to stay in some portion. But I have seen that generally, as a percentage, probably increasing like a small percentage each year, like 5 or 7% in terms of their total IT workload. In fact, one of our customers, which is a large financial institution, their CTO just said that after 2021 ends, that she's not signing off on any on-premise expenditures at all. Anything that she wants, knew that she wants, is going to be going to the cloud. She wants to get out of the data center business.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Very quickly, we have 30 seconds left in the session. Therefore, the time just flew by for us. I would just like to thank you both very much for having this really nice conversation. I think it was very valuable for me and hopefully for everyone listening in as well. And Lukonde, you have a talk following this directly, and Derek, you have a talk later on today. Please check them out as well, and see you around at the conference. Have a nice day.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Great chatting with you.
Do I just hold on? Okay, we have 10 seconds left, but it's ending right now. Sorry about the confusion.
Wait, bye.